Eyal Rozmarin, it's fantastic to have you on this podcast talking about therapy and social change. You're a relational psychoanalyst and you are the editor of Perspectives on Psychoanalysis, the book series. And we wanted to talk to you about the work that you do and also how you see the link between therapy and social change. You've written some fascinating papers, really, really exciting papers from a psychoanalytic perspective, amazingly well informed about belonging and how groups and belongings and how that works with our psyche and how that impacts on the social environment and what that means for us personally, particularly in relation to what's happening currently in Israel and Gaza. And you're from Israel. Eyal, can you maybe start by just telling us a little bit about yourself and what you'd like people to know about kind of your background and where you're coming from?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. It's a great honor and pleasure. You said it. I was born in Israel, Palestine, as I'd like to call it. And I grew up in that crazy place where so many histories converge and war and try to reach another situation sometimes. I grew up with a father who periodically goes to fight a war. The first one when I was alive was the 6-Day War, then it was October, then it was in 73 and so on. So I'm used to actually growing up with my father away for months at a time and also exposed to the narratives and ideologies that are involved in that. I had problems with it from the beginning almost. Definitely since I was an adolescent. I had an interesting experience, or rather non-experience with the army, which I can talk about at some point. But then I left Israel. I went to United States, to New York, to do my PhD. And I think it's those two kind of collision or points or changes. One, when I had to really become what a Jewish Israeli boy must become, and which is kind of a soldier, basically. Could not really do it. And then, so first point of tension, let's say, dramatic tension, and then becoming an immigrant and understanding how we're all looked at through the projections of other people and through the ideas of other people, and seeing what it's like to be from one culture and having to live in another, really made me interested and conscious and many other such things to how we are made socially, how much our psychologies, our very selves, are made by the environments around us and changed by the environments around us. So this, as I became a psychologist and psychoanalyst and started writing and thinking, that sort of independently became, almost by itself, became my focus.
So how did you experience that, Eyal? You said about coming to the States from Israel and seeing yourself. Was it through the eyes of others? What did that mean to you as an immigrant?
Well, the first thing that happens is that you behave, and I've traveled to the U.S. a lot before I came to live here. I did a different graduate degree that was part also in the U.S. So I had experience, but with being here. But there was one moment I was already starting my PhD. I was studying at the New School. And I was in a seminar, and the professor said something. It was the very beginning. And then I said, no, I don't think so. And this is something you don't do in the United States. You don't say no to a professor. You say, well, of course, let's try. But maybe if you look at it from Israel, I'm kind of a relatively polite and not aggressive guy, but I realized that I'm perceived as this aggressive monster all of a sudden. So there are many things like that where you realize that the way you're raised, or the way you are, translates completely differently in other places. So that's one big thing. And then, I have this funny name. It's a little detail, but nobody can ever pronounce my name, for example. So that really keeps you in an angle. Every time you introduce myself, you have to hear back that butchering. It's really funny, but it keeps you always. And then, of course, there's the projections that people hear. Oh, you're from there, so you must be ABC. You must be thinking ABC. So you really learn quickly, if you didn't realize it before, how much you're a creature of other people's narratives. And when you grow up in a certain place, it's somewhat of a seamless process. So perhaps you don't realize it that much, but when you come and you confront other narratives, it becomes so evident. Now, for me, I had to be an immigrant, but there's so many people. I'm also gay, so that's another way in which, that's a fact that's being discovered all of a sudden, and because I don't necessarily present it's all those identity categories and cultures that you find yourself embodying. And when you become conscious of it, it's just kind of stunning.
You seem to be describing it both from the inside in terms of how you're shaped culturally, but then in terms of from the outside, in terms of the projections that are put on you, in terms of coming from a particular culture, that both form a particular way of being and a kind of surprise, a kind of recognition of who you are through that both inside and outside cultural process.
I think you become aware of how much you are told all the time who you are. And sometimes that there's tension between what you're told and what you feel. Although what you feel is never independent of what you're told. I mean, I'm a white passing male. So for me, it's a bit of a discovery, but many other categories in society, it's not such a big surprise to find out that they're being identified and projected upon just because of skin color or gender or many other things like that.
You're saying that people from more marginalized groups would be more aware of that from the beginning, and that your immigrant experience gave you that, which maybe you stayed in Israel you wouldn't have had.
Yeah, or would have been a more nuanced thing, I didn't have a Fanonian moment.
Sorry, what?
I didn't have the moment that Fanon speaks about, right? That, hey, or that person, what is that person doing here?
Eyal, explain that. Franz Fanon, people might not be familiar with that.
Fanon in Black Skin, White Masks talks about many important things, but one thing that he talks about is that he's walking, so he's a black man, he's in France, and some child points to his mother and says, I think he says, oh, mom, a Negro, or something like that. So that there's the moment of being identified as a unique and now I'm becoming self-conscious that I said a word that may be problematic for some people that a person who's not black said. So
it is something about those moments of identifying yourself as another, as being different, or having a particular identity in some way. But I wanted to ask you, because one of the things that you talk about in your paper is about the bare human. That's B-A-R-E, not B-E-A-R, the bare human, which is, as I understood it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but is the kind of human behind or beneath the collectivization, beneath the social. And I wondered, what you're describing here and what you also write in your paper that we'll come back to is the way that our very identities, as you were describing there, is fundamentally shaped both internally and externally or intersubjectively through our relationships with others. So how does that work? Are you suggesting, or do you hold that there's some essential pre-socialized self, or are we always fundamentally in relation?
Well, when I write The Bare Human, I'm actually taking from Giorgio Agamben, who has this concept of bare life, actually. And his idea is at least conceptually, there is this thing of a bare life that it is prior or could be thought of as independent of this socializing machine, what he calls sovereignty, that thing that exists before, at least again conceptually, we become subjects. Because when you're a subject, you're already, subject of, subject under. You're a subject as a person, you're a subject of the state, you're a subject of a political system. So Agamben tries to think about this pure concept of bare life before. Does it exist in reality? I don't think so. Because there's no such thing of the moment where, even before we are born, there's concepts of us. We arrive at concepts of us already, whether it's the imaginations of our parents who have a certain kind of child in mind and have imaginations for this child from what they're like from baby to child to adult to what kind of heir they will become, to my legacy. And then, of course, we're born to this big machine that tells us what a person is, and that teaches us language and words to use to understand ourselves, and concepts and narratives. And so I don't think we exist independently of all that. Even before you have the idea of conceiving a child, you have a lot of ideas of what a child is, what their role in your life will be, and so on. But it's a nice concept to have in mind to understand the massive thing that makes you not that, right? That makes this impossible to have, just to be your true self, or all those things that we're, wanting to be. There's no such thing.
So what you're suggesting challenges, say, in the person-centered framework, the idea of a organismic self, a real self. That what you're suggesting is that that we are always infused by the being of the world and the collective around us. One of the things that you write is that, which I loved, is that you say that when you go all the way in, you find otherness. When you go all the way in, you find otherness. That even at our very core, there isn't some kind of bare human, it's a kind of chimera. There is always otherness.
Mm-hmm. That's an idea that actually is, if you think about it, it's deep in it's deeply at the core of psychoanalysis. The idea that the unconscious, that you have inside you stuff that you're not in control of, that is put in there in all kinds of ways by all kinds of whatever psychoanalytic school you believe in or combination. There's different stories of how it gets in there or what's there, but the idea is that there's a lot of strangeness and foreignness and unknownability inside you. It's the basic idea of psychoanalysis, that the self is divided, that we're not on top of ourselves really. But the tradition, and there's Laplanche, who was really wonderful in that sense, that says that the unconscious is built from literally otherness, that it's the desire of the parents that is unknown to us, that is the heart of our unconscious.
Eyal, can you explain that a bit more?
Laplanche just takes the Freudian idea in a particular direction, which I find fascinating, but it's actually in Freud already, not articulated like that. Laplanche, who was a very interesting French psychoanalyst, died not a long time ago. Um, the idea is that you are born and you are born into this environment of which, from the classical psychoanalytic point of view, you are born into the unconscious desire of your parents, their sexuality. That their sexuality, their desire towards each other, towards you in some ways, is there. It's the cause of your being, actually, but you have no way of uh, mentalizing it, conceiving of it. You're a little baby, but it's very present, and it's excessive. It's in excess of what you can deal with.
What did
And
you say? In excessive?
it's in excess. It's beyond what you can deal with. It's excessive. The idea of excess, and it's this excess, this something that is very strong yet enigmatic. It's another important concept of Laplanche. It's enigmatic. You don't get it, but you live in it. That forms the basis of our unconscious, the sexuality of the other. So Laplanche talks about sexuality because it's a classical psychoanalyst, but we can talk about the desire of the other in all kinds of ways. We can talk about the desire of the other, that you are a certain kind of person, the ideological desire of the other, the social desire of the other, and not just of your immediate people, but as you grow, society at large has huge desires of you, which are totally excessive to what you can make sense of. So if you take Laplanche further, it's this massive world of forces and desires that is around us that we're the focus of, that we have no way of really mentalizing, containing, understanding at any time except for a little bit. So all of that is the unconscious. If you think socially, that's the social unconscious, the collective unconscious.
So if we take that back to what you were saying earlier, for instance, about being an Israeli man, there'd be this suggestion that the kind of demands of Israeli or any society and a particular construction of masculinity or whatever gender is something that is imposed on us, but in quite an it's held unconsciously rather than consciously, and becomes something that guides us. And presumably psychoanalysis becomes the process of reconnecting and rediscovering that in some way.
For me, it's very important. And if we think both theoretically and clinically, for me, it has been a gradual understanding, or at least belief, that you cannot do the work seriously without also beginning to understand this.
What does that mean, Eyal? What does that mean in terms of your work? Tell us a bit. So you're a relational psychoanalyst.
Yeah.
Where does that then come into your work? What do you do? Is it things that is it how you interpret, how you understand? Is it how you relate to clients? What's the kind of concrete consequences of that?
I have it in mind the same way that I have in mind the idea that how you were held by your caregiver, your mother, your father, whoever it is that held you when you were a baby and took you out of bed or didn't, or fed you on time or didn't, is an important big part of what you're like now. And the same way, if you like the Oedipus story, there was a competition between you and your parents or your siblings, and at some point, and so on and so on. I have in mind all of that I said, that you were born into a certain social class and a certain social idea and into a certain ethnic group and its own position in society. And you were told certain stories about what a person is and what your role is and what a person like you can become, and so on and so forth, and who are your friends and who are your enemies and who you should be suspicious of, and that all that lives in you as well. And I will assume that, and when it seems to the point, I will ask questions about it, and I will go there. And I will also ask in the very beginning, setting the stone, I do it with my patients, when you start, what questions you put on the table in the very beginning, the first session, the first few sessions, is something that is important to think about. So you have a way of setting the tone and setting the subject matter. And so I always ask in the very beginning, people ask about your parents. Okay, what about your grandparents? Where are they from? Where did they come? I ask about ethnic origin, about immigration, about the countries they come from. I ask about class. I ask about who does what and how much money there was. And I just ask all these questions so people have in mind that that's important stuff, which a lot of people in our profession don't do. So a patient may be thinking a lot of things and thinking, oh, but that's not the right thing to talk about here. And when things happen in the world, especially if I think there is some connection, I will ask about that. I will ask, so how do you feel about what's happening in Israel now? I will ask. So I just keep putting out, I don't force it, but I keep putting this range of possibilities on the table. Some people bite, some people don't. I don't necessarily force, but sometimes I feel I have to, and then I do it.
So what you're saying there is that you would use that understanding of the person as located in their social world and what they might not be aware of as a way of helping deepen and broaden their awareness by bringing in political things, by bringing in cultural things, their ancestors, what's going on in the world, what kind of social norms come up. And you'd say that would you say to a client something like, if I was coming to see you and I was, say, finding it hard to show my vulnerability, would you, in my relationship, would you say something like, I wonder, Mick, if that's about you being a man? How would you bring it in? How would you introduce it?
That sounds like something I might say.
Uh-huh.
But I'll give you an example. For various reasons, I'm close to Chile. I like Chile, and I know a lot about the history of Chile. So if a person came to me who's Chilean, I would ask, and let's say they're 40 years old. Then I would say, oh, so you were born, there was still a dictatorship when you were born. It's enough. Or I would ask, so your parents, so you're from this kind of background. So I'm curious that your parents were for Pinochet or against Pinochet? What was the family like? And it's enough, a few questions like that to get a whole map of, I come from this kind of background. We had this tension with the regime or did not. We were scared by the dictatorship or not. My uncle disappeared. You would get people not necessarily would go to if you don't ask. Definitely, if someone comes to me from Israel, I ask a lot of questions.
What sort of questions?
Well, I try to be knowledgeable about whatever I can be knowledgeable about. So if someone comes to me, let's say from the UK, or I know something, I will ask what part, and I will ask what class. But if somebody comes to me that is an Israeli, I will ask all the way down to the neighborhood they grew up in. And
So what happens, Eyal? I mean, some people might hear that and they might say, wait a minute, therapy is about being neutral. It's about not having a position. Our role isn't to indoctrinate or to shape or to police our patients in some way, our clients to have a particular view. It's not a position I agree with, but how do you answer that when people say therapy is about neutrality? And they may well, I imagine, cite Freud or the beginnings of psychoanalysis and say, look, the whole profession grew up around this idea of neutrality.
I will make a distinction here. First of all, of course, it's not about indoctrinating people and not about making them think what I think. Of course not. Um, there's two, maybe there's two components to the idea of neutrality. One is that you can be non-existent as a person in the room, and I don't believe in that. It's that you can hide so much behind some kind of mask that nobody knows anything about you, and that it's important that it's that way. I just don't, I don't think it's possible, and I don't believe in it, actually. And that perhaps is one of the important, relational tenets that I hold to, that you exist as a person, and the person is dealing with you as a person. It doesn't mean that your personhood should overpower the situation or even be the main, protagonist or the important, but you are there as a person, and to ignore that is to force another kind of unconscious that you're something that you're not allowed to speak about, especially when you get to more social ideas, when the person who comes to you have very specific ideas of who you are, where you come from. Does that enable you to understand them or not? So there's a whole world of fantasy just by looking at you and coming into your room or looking onto your screen and where you are. And so it's there. But I do believe in a sense of that my job and our job is to help people know themselves, not to know me. And definitely not to model themselves after me in any way, except not to be unconscious here, but not except as the model of thinking seriously about things and being able to tolerate and accept tension, conflict, confusion in yourself and with another person. I think that's what we're doing, basically. People come to us and they hopefully become more accepting of themselves, more including whatever it is that's going on with them, and being able to do it with another person, which is a good model for life, to not be isolated in your trouble in yourself, but allowing yourself to be in the world, but not so it's not about indoctrinating, but it's about making you think about certain things. To go really back to the origin of psychoanalysis, it's about, I really believe in it, making the unconscious conscious as much as possible. So all of this stuff that we're speaking about, the social, the political, it's in your unconscious. So let's make it conscious. I'm not going to tell you what to think, but let's talk about it.
Would it be fair to say that psychoanalysis is always about making the unconscious conscious, but the understandings of the unconscious have changed over time? So that with the early model, it's more about the parents, and then there's a relational. Do you think the kind of social political is an extension of the kind of relational psychoanalytic model? Or is it something that kind of goes further? I don't know. Is there tensions in the field about that?
I think that we, and when I say we, I'm talking about myself and some other people around me, Orna, for example, and other people, we've been working for a while to extend this, to make social political thinking part of psychoanalysis. And I think it's happening. It's really happening. Which I think is a really wonderful thing.
So there's a kind of, do you have a term for it? I mean, it's a kind of relational, political, psychoanalytic perspective. It's a bit more than just the relational perspective, I sense.
Yeah, I would say at this point, I don't know if it's relational at this point. I think we definitely owe the possibility, I think, to relational psychoanalysis. Not only there have been people over the years that have been thinking this way, not just out of the relational paradigm, for sure. The one person I think about is Heidi Femberg, who's a very classical psychoanalyst in Paris. There's Abraham and Torok a long time ago. There's the whole school of South American psychoanalysts who thought socially. So it's not only from the relational. I think what the relational field did is two important things happened. First of all, there was a group of feminist psychoanalysts that insisted that we start thinking about gender critically and understanding how gender works and how sexuality works. So the opening of psychoanalysis to feminist thinkers like Adrienne Harris, like Muriel Dimen, like Jessica Benjamin, and others, I think it already forced us to think about social categories as in which gender is, as inherent to the work. We have to understand social categories to do the work. Then there was the wave of, not necessarily separate, of queer theory and how we had to understand that different sexualities are not just diagnostic or experience, but the sexualities work as social constructs as well. And we have to understand how they work as social constructs. So gender, sexuality as social constructs, that's a lot of what this journal that I was involved in the past did, was studies in gender and sexualities to bring that into the field. And then when you realize that the very inherent parts of how we define ourselves as man, woman, gay, straight, is social constructs, then the road is open to understanding that there's ethnicity, there's race, which is of course very important today. There's many that we are constructed socially, and that you cannot do psychoanalysis ignoring that fact. And so it comes from, at least to a big extent, this trajectory comes from relational psychoanalysis and from the fact that certain people in New York went in a relational direction. In the UK too, of course. But I think now it's beyond that. There are people who think primarily that. There is tension. There is tension. It keeps being a tension in the field. I don't know if it's so important, but there is tension that people say, oh, but we should just think clinically, as if you can think clinically independent of that. That this whole social thing has went too far. In some ways, maybe it did. Some, the pendulum swings. But I am very, very, very pleased that we've went in that direction, because otherwise we're just unconscious.
What are the links between, or are there links between that kind of psychoanalytic perspective and then the wider psychotherapy and counseling field? Because I mean, my knowledge of, for instance, multicultural counseling in the States is they're doing some really interesting work particularly around race, but also sexuality, trans issues. I get a sense, maybe I'm wrong, but that work there, or the work, say, in psychotherapy and some of the humanistic work, isn't so well linked up with the kind of work that you're doing in the more psychoanalytic field. It seems that they're a bit kind of compartmentalized. I don't know what you think.
My answer will be a proof of your question. I don't really know. I don't know. I'm part of I'm in a certain corner of the field, and I'm in conversation with people in this corner and maybe other people, but I'm actually not fully aware of what happens in other segments. I do, in my teaching, when I teach, I get to meet people who are becoming psychoanalysts, but coming from other, from social work, from not necessarily from psychology or psychiatry. And there's a lot to learn from that, of course, but I'm actually not very aware. I can't really answer this question. So I'm proving that you're right. That there's not a lot, not everybody knows about everybody.
I mean, it was interesting in your paper, it's a lot about belonging and the kind of core of belonging. So I was also thinking about belonging in the therapy world and the way that I guess we all belong to different communities. But I wanted to ask you about that. I mean, it was a fascinating paper, and you really kind of argue that what you talk to now is the kind of the nuances of sociality that it kind of shapes us. But I think in that paper you talk about belonging as the kind of core of violence and the kind of very negative, destructive death instinct kind of element of belonging. And you talk about, I guess, what I would understand as contra the original Freud, that the death instinct, that kind of destructiveness, comes from our desire and our need to belong. Um, can you say a bit more about that? And maybe also about maybe how that can help us understand what's going on in the world at the moment?
So first of all, the reason I started thinking about belonging or using this notion is that we have a lot of theory from other fields, from social theory, political theory, about how the social mechanism, political mechanism, and so on work on us. So from the outside, all the forces that sit on us. But there's less work. There is some, but there's Judy Butler, for example, has a good book about it. But it's not, especially in psychoanalysis, there hasn't been much work about what makes us desire it. So it's not just that there's all these things crushing us. We want it. We need it. We need the same way our parents don't just oppress us, but actually give us what we need to live. It's the same with society. It's society works on us because we need it also, because we need to be part of. We cannot exist by ourselves, not physically, not mentally, and we need the language, we need the concepts. We're sense-making creatures. So for me, the idea of belonging is what makes this connection, the idea that we need to belong and that there's a sort of a drive to belong. And it's this need to belong that all the social sits on. And so we have an interaction. And so this is why I got interested in the concept of belonging. So it's in itself a neutral thing. You need to belong. You want to belong. It's not by necessity a violent or aggressive thing. It's a loving, needing, vulnerable, fragile, everything. The thing is, that, how shall I put it? Societies, groups, they need our need to belong in order to work. And they use it for their purposes. Now, I'm not talking here conspiracy theory. I'm just talking about that societies have structures and groups have structures. And there are all kind of ways in which group connect you to them and then use you to do what they need. So, and then we have the fact that humanity as a whole is not just a harmonious body, but there are groups of conflicts and societies and conflicts. So then you wind up with a situation that out of your need to belong, you do things for the group to which you belong. And sometimes you wind up having to sacrifice yourself for the group that you belong to. So there's something paradoxical in this situation. You belong in order to live, and sometimes you find yourself dying for that purpose. Freud, as his thing, it was try to put everything into biology in the end. So he, at least originally, the idea was that we have drives. And after 20 years of theorizing the pleasure principle and the idea that we're driven to live and procreate and et cetera, and after a bad world war, he started thinking we're not just driven to live, we're also driven to die. The whole idea of the death principle, the death instinct, comes from not being able to account for a world war. With his theory of the pleasure principle, it just doesn't work. And he had two versions of the death drive, not to get into too much, but the idea is that we have this basic aggressive, competitive thing in us, which leads us sometimes to the extreme of killing and destroying and so on. The point that I'm trying to make is that this ability that we have to kill and this need that we have to kill sometimes, and the fact that we do kill sometimes, it's not because it's, or not only because it's inherent to our biologies, especially not the way we kill. You know, animals kill when they're hungry. We kill for very many reasons, not just because we're hungry. That it is a condition, it is a social condition. Violence is a condition of social living. It's not something that emanates from inside. It's a condition of social living. It's a condition, and then you can go into theories of what is the reality of it. I mentioned in this paper René Girard, who talks about the inherent competition, Elias Canetti. But yeah, that societies are violent in nature because there is competition on resources, because people copy each other, they want the same thing. Whatever explanation you go to there, the idea is that violence is inherent to societies and it's demanded of us as members in society. It's not coming from some kind of urge, it's demanded of us. And so the death drive is socially driven. That's in a nutshell.
Do you think ideas like that, like your analysis there and what we've learned from therapy, psychoanalysis, do you think that has a contribution to make to understanding some of the ills, some of the awful things that are happening in the world at the moment?
Well, that's a big question and an interesting one, and I'm interested in that question. I think so. If you look at what goes on now in Gaza, Israel and Palestine and Gaza, there are two people, but even when you say that, it becomes more complicated because what is combining everyone into one people is unclear. What is the Jews? What is the Palestinians? There's really many, many facets. But let's say that there's a whole myriad of people that are gathered into two collectives, and those collectives are killing each other in most horrible, horrible ways. There are extremes in those two collectives who are driven by religious messianic narratives in which only one people has a place there. There's the, let's say, Hamas ideology that says that Palestine needs to be a Muslim caliphate, not so much caliphate, but it needs to be a Muslim entity. And I don't think they want to kill the Jews. That's not in the, but they either want the Jews out or they want the Jews to be subservient to the Muslims, as was in the days of Muhammad. There's the exact equivalent on the Jewish side. There's the Messianic religious Jews who think that Israel, Palestine should become as it was in the days of the Bible, which is, of course, a fiction also, if you really look into it. But there's a narrative of what it was like, and we need a temple again, and that if the Jews should be in control. And again, they don't want to kill all the Arabs, but they want the Arabs to be subservient to the Jews. So it's a very parallel two forces, not much difference between them, I think. The Jewish Messianics have a whole big army in their service, so they don't need to fly with paragliders over but they have a big army that's doing the job for them. So one question is to understand, how does that work? How does that work that there are a lot of people, there are actually minorities in each collective, very powerful minorities that run their lives according to this narrative, that there's a book, and in this book, there's a promise for me to have this thing, and I'm going to dedicate my life and my children's life and everything to getting that thing, which is to have a Muslim country, to have a Jewish country here. That's one interesting story. How does that work? And then there is a lot of in the middle, which I think is the majority of people who don't want to kill anybody and don't necessarily want dominance, but who are susceptible to the collective narratives that tell them your safety is endangered by the other people, and give us your children, and they're going to fight for our safety. They're not messianic, they're not religious necessarily, but they have bought into the major narratives. And these are the people that for me are most interesting in a sense, because they are the majority everywhere, I think. And then there's another minority, which I hope I belong to, which is the people who say, leave us with your bullshit. We are the same people. Let us try to make something together. I don't want to, it's not you or me. We have to be together to make something happen and not buy that, whatever they're telling you. I'm being simplistic here, but so I think there's three groups in societies, especially societies in wars, that we have to understand. I think what's happening now is a proof that we don't have a good language. We don't have a good political language that at least is convincing to enough people. And we don't have a good enough theoretical language, because at least what's happening here in the US, everybody has a story of why they believe what they believe. And, as I write in the paper, most of these stories are hard to believe, and yet people believe them. So it's here that we get into, I think, what psychology or psychoanalysis can contribute, is to try to understand why people believe what they believe. Why is it so important? What is at work, for example, to raise now, in my mind, a really and it's easy for me to say as a Jew, an over anxiety of anti-Semitism. There is anti-Semitism, but I feel now that there is this talk about this exploiting of the fear of psycho. That was what's that a nice slip? I was going to say fear of psychoanalysis, but I mean fear of anti-Semitism. What's going on that Jews are all of a sudden afraid of anti-Semitism more than in my mind is justified? But I've been blamed being raised in Israel that I don't have the right radar for it because I grew up as a majority Jew, not as a so I don't have the radar for it. But I still think, especially what goes on here in the United States, that there's the rage about anti-Semitism now is a big distraction. It's easier to attack the critics than to look at what's going on and say, this is done in my name.
And I'm aware of the time and we need to bring things to a close, but Eyal, I wanted to ask what you're, because it sounds like what you're saying is maybe psychoanalytic, psychological thinking can help us understand more, both perhaps extremes, but what you're saying is maybe more importantly, the people in the middle, the people who are pulled, maybe for the need for belonging, maybe because of the issues of identity and self that you talked about earlier. And perhaps if we can understand those processes more, we can do something. Is there a do something there? Presumably the do something isn't putting everyone in psychoanalysis. It's informing.
So okay, two registers. One is in the consulting room with our work, with my work, with patients. It is these days, it's true in some ways always, but in these days, really a lot of people are losing their minds. Not really, but it's very unsettling what's going on in the world and and something got triggered by what goes on in Gaza. And people are looking to understand themselves. I see everyone, but of course I have a good chunk of Israelis in my practice, and they're really especially hard trying to figure out what's going on and how to relate to it and what's justified and what's not justified. So you find yourselves talking day after day. We're having political discussions in which you try to understand what's going on and you try to understand how it feels and what it does to you and how it confuses you and how it angers you and how it affects your relationships with people, your family, your friends. So that's part of I feel today, part of the job for all of us, and it's forced upon us, especially in this location in New York, just to do the work one person at a time. There's also some very interesting generational things happening now, because different generations are differently socialized. My generation, my parents' generation is not my generation, our kids' generation, where maybe kids are going to college now and are on the campuses as all of this is happening, and then coming home and have to settle this with their parents and might be thinking different. So it's very interesting to understand what's happening generationally as well. And then on the social level, I think our job is our position is so minimal compared to what's going on and the forces that are at play and the governments and the businesses and the oil and the money and the weapons and the Putins and the Bidens and the Ayatollah. I mean, we don't have much of a impact, but I think we can do our work one person at a time, and we can help to try to unpack some of the fantasies and the splits and the defenses that people are in. and create a space where you can actually look at what's going on and live with it, although it's very hard. And and to try to engage a general discussion, both in our community, which I think is, there's many communities, of course, but communities of people who think theoretically, psychologically, and people are listening to us to the little extent that they do, to try to insert a lot of complexity and to always question those splittings that are so rampant now. And that's what I try to do. But I don't know how effective it is in the grand scheme of things. And it's actually, I don't know how you guys feel, but for me, it's all very unbearable. Also being from there and just seeing what's happening and the shame, the guilt, can't deal.
Yeah.
So,
Eyal, thank you so much for your time. It's been so rich and so deep, and there's been so much that you shared there. And I really heard what you said at the end about it being unbearable, and it'd be nice to tie it up in a nice bow and say, here are the positives. But I guess that's where we are in the world at the moment. And what you're talking about is trying to do one person at a time, work with one person, and bring about change in whatever way we can.
there's one thing I'd like to add that, not to finish completely on this note. There are groups of people out there that are doing incredible work, connecting, bridging. I'm familiar with some groups like that operate in Israel, Palestine, that I follow, that I get inspired by. So I'd like to name them. There's a group that's called Combatants for Peace, which is made of, and I mentioned them in a paper, it is made of people who were fighters on both sides, either in the Israeli army or in the resistance movement in Fatah, on the Palestinian side, who decided to work together in a non-violent way, and they have forums and they have ceremonies together and they have discussion groups, and they're very active and they're very inspiring to watch. There's a group called the Family Circle, which is a group of parents or people generally who lost significant others to the conflict, both on the Jewish and Israeli and Palestinian side, who keep coming together. And there's a new group called Standing Together, which is made of Jews and Palestinians from Palestine who are trying to organize, especially these days when everybody's in danger, to organize ways to collaborate, to create mutual safety networks, and there's a group of, actually, I'm part of a group of clinicians, of Israeli and Palestinian clinicians in Israel, Palestine, a WhatsApp group that insists on keeping a very, very tight conversation throughout these days. And they're also a source of inspiration for me. So there are people who are working hard to actually counter the wave.
Thank you so much, Eyal, and thank you, John and Erwin, for hosting the conversation today.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.